Hey everybody, welcome to The Hobby, the online podcast devoted to tabletop war games and all that implies. I'm your host, Dan Davis, and with me as always, a man who's never afraid to pull out his Panzerknocker, James Fisher.
How's it going today, Dan?
Oh man, I can't complain. I'm ready to get going. Today on The Hobby, we're going to talk about scale, and by scale I mean the scale of different models, how they relate to each other. Also, going to talk a little bit about scale involving gameplay, table size, ranges, model size, that sort of thing. And of course the games themselves, the scale or scope of what a game covers. Let's talk a little bit about the scale of games, starting out with the grand strategy, which tends to focus on a war or a series of war over a longer period of time. A really complex game, a lot of things going on, not just the military aspect, but the economic, political aspects, that sort of thing. So complex, in fact, that typically you only see games like this done on the computer, like with Civilization or something like that.
Yeah, there are the occasional board or card game that try to simulate this, but these days it's mostly seen on a computer.
The next level of game is known as the strategic game, which typically focuses on military units, typically division, corps, or army size. The simulation typically involves all branches. Often the entire forces of nations are involved.
Once again, this used to be a real popular game to play as board games, but has also kind of migrated to the computer world.
Next up is operational, where units are typically battalion to division size and rated based on average overall strengths and weaknesses. Weather and logistics could be factors, and the simulation typically focuses on one branch of the military, with the other somewhat abstracted, usually covering a single campaign. Next up, the games I think most of us are most familiar with, tactical war games, where units can range from individual vehicles and squads to platoons or company, and are rated based on the types and ranges of individual weaponry. A real focus in on the game action, as it were. Almost always seems to focus on a single branch, occasionally with others abstracted, and usually covers a single battle or part of a larger battle.
Popular scales for this game include micro armor or 1/285th and 15 millimeter.
And typically this scale of game would also cover your one-off games, where you simply just line up in points-based type of confrontations. And of course the smallest thing we were looking at is skirmish level. Units are typically individual soldiers with the possible tracking of wounds and ammunition. The simulation usually covers a small firefight, also known as man-to-man scale.
Popular games in this scale are Mordheim, Necromunda,
and don't forget the greatness of Blood Bowl.
Right.
And so, taking what we know about the different scales of games, let's look at the actual scales of the models and the things that we play with while we're playing these games. James, what do you know about all that?
As far as model scale goes, I'd like to basically talk about, let's start off with talking about the two different major scales that people talk about when they are wargaming. There is scale, which is kind of a 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 or 1-to-3 scale, which is the basic concept of taking the size of something and then scaling it down to a sizable miniature. For instance, if you had a man who was 1 inch tall, and you wanted to scale him up, say, 100 times, and he would be 1/100th scale of an inch. The other major scale that's used is millimeter. A lot of people know 15 millimeter, 10 millimeter, 25 millimeter, but what this means, and it's a little bit more confusing than the scale term, is the average height of a man from his feet to his eyeballs. Not his feet to his head, but his feet to his eyeballs.
Feet to his eyeballs, because I guess there's a lot going on above the eye line, depending on the type of game you're looking at, as far as headpieces, things like that, uniform, armor, whatever.
Absolutely. You could have a guy running around in a beret, which would take up no height. You could have a guy running around in a helmet, which could take up some height. And then you could have guys like, say, Empire guys for fantasy, running around with plumage that runs, 6 inches above their head with feathers and whatnot.
There is that.
And then there's also a third scale that we can briefly go over. It's not usually a gaming scale, but people use a lot of pieces for this in their game, which is railroad model scale, such as HON, TT, and Z scale. These will mainly only come into play because people might want to use these things as terrain for their board games or their miniature games, such as their houses,
right,
their trees, that kind of things. Basically, there are 3 dozen different scale miniatures out there that people play with, but I'd like to focus on the most popular ones, being 15 millimeter, 25 or 28 millimeter. Now, when I talk about 25 and 28 millimeter, I'm basically going to call them both the same thing as 25 millimeter. And then one 285th scale, or as branded as Micro Armor. Micro Armor is a very interesting scale. It's one 285th scale, so it's an American style scale. It became popular in the 80s as kind of a way to game Cold War games, and it's actually a scale that the military adopted for their sandbox style simulations of how they're going to plan out combat and whatnot. So it's a very interesting scale. Most people like to play it on the company to division size with say 30 to 60 tanks per side. A very fun scale. And as far as how it relates to millimeter, if you're wanting to try and convert it over, it literally converts over to 5.6 millimeters, but more roughly it converts to 6 millimeters. So 100 285th scale is 6 millimeter. The second major scale is 15 millimeter. Now 15 millimeter literally converts over to 1/120th scale. But a lot of people use other scales that are very close to 15 millimeters, such as 1/100th, 1/110th, that kind of thing. And then there's 25-28 millimeter scale. 25-28 millimeter scale might be one of the most popular scales because it's the scale that's been used by Games Workshop games, as well as some other manufacturers' games such as Reaper and Devil Dogs. And it's mainly the scale that people want to play with, where they play with one-on-one type skirmish games that include, you know, infantry and vehicles of that sort, where they're playing on the squad per squad or platoon per platoon type games. Just going over how this relates to, say, the average infantry model. As you look here, you'll see 4 different scales we have here. The first one being 100 285th scale, which is Micro Armor scale. As you notice, this guy has still got a lot of detail for him, considering how small he is. If you look at the next guy up, that's 15 millimeter, and that's going to roughly relate to, you know, 1/200th scale. And then the next guy up from that is a 25 millimeter guy. The 25 millimeter guy is actually about 1 1/16 inches tall. And if you look at the guy next to him, the 28 millimeter guy, both of these I think can still be used on the same table, even though they're different scales. The 28 millimeter guy is actually only 1 1/8 inch tall, so it's only a 1/16 of an inch difference. So when you get them all out on the board together, if they're not exactly in the same squads, I still think that the scales relate to each other enough to play with them on the same table.
Hey, besides, not all guys are the same height, right?
That's a good point. Not everybody is 5 inches, 5 foot 3 inches tall to their eyes, or average 6 foot tall. Now, as far as tanks, here's a display of 2 different Tiger tank and a Panther tank, 2 different tanks, and kind of how you can kind of see how the scales relate to each other. This first collection of tanks is Micro Armor, or 1 285th scales. If you notice how they look different from the 1 1/44th scale, you still get a lot of detail in both sizes. The 15 millimeter tanks offer the painter a lot more opportunity to get more detailed with their stuff, but it's still pretty small. A 1/72nd scale is a very popular modeling scale, but for some reason has never caught on to gaming. I personally think that it's because game manufacturers know how many other model companies out there make 1/72nd scale, and they want to be able to sell and brand their own products, so they come up with a different scale than this 1/72nd scale. The next size up is 1 1/50th scale, or 1/50th scale. That's the closest thing to 25 millimeter, 28 millimeter that's out there. 1/48 scale, 1/64 scale, all these scales are roughly close enough to work on the same table, I believe, as the 25 millimeter guys.
Due to the 10-minute time limit imposed by YouTube on the videos we post here, we had to break episode 4 up into 2 parts. Part 2, and the continuation of the discussion on scale, is already up and available for download now. You can find that by searching our YouTube account, Arball817, ARBKAL817. Thanks a lot.